We're in the month of May, and most people, when they think of May, they think of sell in May and go away. I look at buying in May and what are the cheapest options for May. I want to talk about cheapest options. I look at 6 different optionable type of lists when I come into each week. I look at stocks and options that have the highest volume. I look at options that have the highest open interest. Okay, that's the number of folks that are crowding into an option trade. They could be sellers, they could be buyers, but open interest means I've opened a position in the markets. I also look at unusual call volume. All right, that means I could look at anything that has a regular call volume and all of a sudden spikes, and I want to know what strike that is, what month that is. I want to know everything I can about that particular stock and what's going on with it. Same thing with the unusual put volume. There could be a big amount of put sellers. There could be a big amount of put buyers. That list gives me that unusual activity. And then finally, what I look at is I look at an overall view of how cheap or how expensive those options are on all optional stocks. Now, the way I do that is pretty much the same way maybe a weatherman would look at weather patterns. So here we are in Florida. It is May. We're now May 5th, and we're seeing May where we're seeing high 60s as a low and low 80s as a high. I imagine if we were seeing 60s as a high, that would be very cold for the month of May. And if we saw lows in the 80s and highs well above that, that would tell us that we probably are sitting at more higher temperatures on record than lows. I look at option volatility the same way. What we do is we look at implied volatility, we stamp it for each day, and we start to create a line. All right, we start to create a chart from that. And we view that against its own, so if it's Apple, if it's Amazon, any stock has its highs and lows of volatility. We try to find those patterns. And when they're low, it tells us that options, those near money calls and puts are cheaper. When it's high, we look at those near money calls and puts being expensive. And we rank those over the course of a year. So these are the 10 cheapest options for the month of May. And again, what we're seeing here is I've got a couple of them in green. I got MicroStrategy in green. I've got BitX in green. I've got Coinbase in green. I've got GME in green. And then there's some other ones, and I see DJT down there at the bottom. What's the common denominator here? When I see MicroStrategy, BitX, Coinbase, GameStop, they're all in one way or another involved in Bitcoin, because digital assets right now are as cheap as I've seen them in the last year. All right? Take a look at MicroStrategy. MicroStrategy has come back from being a $240 stock to just coming off of $400 a share on Friday. But you know what's down? The options implied volatility. It's come down. It came down before the earnings came out. It came down before the earnings came out because you know what's happening with MicroStrategy? MicroStrategy is not going to have this big high in earnings anymore because it's just basically becoming a Bitcoin treasury. So you can get a really good idea of MicroStrategy and what it's likely to do based on the price of Bitcoin. So MicroStrategy's up, and MicroStrategy's options have come way down. They are as cheap as they've been in the course of a year. So if you like MicroStrategy options and you're bullish, you might be looking at buying calls. If you're bearish, you might be looking at buying puts because they're as cheap as they've been. Now, I don't look at cheap in terms of dollar premium. We might look at the call options on MicroStrategy and say, Tom, these are still expensive. But what you could do is you could go out of the money a bit and you could look at different bullish strategies. Besides buying calls, you could buy call spreads, you could do butterflies, anything that's volatility friendly for you in a cheap option environment. GameStop. Here's another one that is leaning into Bitcoin, into holding Bitcoin. Now, the options are cheap on GameStop, even though we have 32 days before its earnings report. It typically starts to move higher in the month prior to its earnings. Okay, earnings are estimated a month from tomorrow. And so on June 6th, we see these earnings, this earnings announcement happening. So there is not only a probability that these are not only cheap, a probability that this might be the cheapest we see them over the next month. And then the last one I'll mention is DJT, Trump Media and Technology. So Trump Media Technology, you might say, this doesn't have anything to do with Bitcoin. It has a lot to do with crypto, okay, because they have their own meme coins, etc. And so when you look at DJT, the one common denominator here between it and the other two, if you want to have an argument about whether or not this is based on crypto or not, is that we know where the high is in IV. It was back in January. We know where the absolute low was. That was in February. We are closer today to the lows so far in this chart than to the highs. Cheap options. So May brings not only May flowers, April showers bring May flowers, May brings something new with it. It's lower volatility. As earnings announce, implied volatility across the board drops. That's because the unknown, which is the earnings report, becomes known. And because of that, sometimes the best time to buy option prices and buy options are after earnings, because those option prices become very cheap. Cheap for the call buyer who's bullish, and cheap for the put buyer who's bearish.